Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop, all the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Good evening. Welcome to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Lindsey Davis Stover, and I'm excited to have with me this evening Delegate David Reid, who represents the 32nd District here in Virginia. David, thanks so much for being with us this evening.
Thanks, Lindsey. It's great to be back again.
Well, start by telling us, and the audience in particular, where the 32nd District is here in Northern Virginia.
Sure. So if you think about Loudoun County, the 32nd District is actually in the eastern part of the county. So it doesn't go all the way to Leesburg, and it doesn't go all the way to the Fairfax County line. So it's kind of right smack dab in the middle part of the eastern part of Loudoun County. It does go all the way up to the Potomac River. It includes Ashburn, Broadlands, and then it goes far enough south that it includes a little bit of Brambleton. When these districts were drawn in 2011, each one of the districts were drawn to represent about 80,000 people. Because of the growth here in eastern Loudoun County, this district now has about 100,000 people in it. So it's extremely densely populated. It's one of the few districts across the entire state that are exclusively contained within one county. So it's really been an honor to be able to represent this district for the last 3.5 years or so. And one of the key things I think you should take away from this is that as we're looking at this and we're doing this online, 70% of the world's internet traffic flows through my district.
Wow. That's incredible. I know we were speaking right before we went on the air. All of these new things we have been forced to learn during the pandemic. And it's amazing that 70% of all the internet traffic goes right through your district. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, it does. And it's one of those things where this is due to the data centers out here. And I know that a lot of people kind of think that data centers don't employ a lot of people, but there are people just like right around the corner from me who sell data center services. And this has really been an integral part to us being able to actually kind of exist during this COVID-19 pandemic, is being able to have access to internet services like this for being able to do telemedicine, for being able to do online learning and all of those things. But one of the things that, and I know that this might be getting ahead of things, one of the things that's been really important to me is recognizing that while we live here and we have access to high-speed broadband access, there are other parts of the state that do not have access to that. And that's been one of the priorities that I've been trying to focus on as a delegate, because as we continue to deal with this, it's going to be difficult for people in other parts of the state to be able to have access to schools and learning facilities as well as medicine if we're not able to make broadband available to them. And
David, that's such an incredible point. I mean, all throughout Virginia, I know here in Fairfax County, where my children go to school, we are all virtual going into this next school year. And so whether it's doctor's appointments, telehealth online, or school, and so many small businesses and now large businesses are really depending on the internet to stay connected. That's such an incredible point to make during this time.
Yeah, and like I said, it's one of those things where I have actually, we had to, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to unallot a certain amount of money from the budget when we went back into session for the reconvene or veto session. And one of the budget amendments that I have put back in is to actually restore the about $70 million in the rural broadband funding that had been taken out. Because again, we have to think about the fact that there are some places in the state that don't have access to high-speed broadband like we do. And also the other thing is that by making that investment now, it helps to lay the groundwork for us to be able to expand economic development in those areas in the future, because broadband really has become the version of rural electrification for the 21st century that electrification was during the early part of the 20th century.
Well, it doesn't surprise me at all that you're being a champion for our rural areas. In fact, an Inside Scoop, we did a show a few weeks ago where we called Raising Rural Voices, and your name came up time and time again for what a champion you have been for the issues in rural communities. So that is exciting to hear that you have that amendment in the way.
So, Lindsey, one of the things I think that maybe people don't know about me is I was actually born and raised in Rockbridge County, which is where Buena Vista and Lexington are. And I grew up very poor. And so I'm very familiar with the area and some of the things that they go on there. When I left there and then went to go live at the Methodist Children's Home in Richmond, when I was living at the house that we had there in Buena Vista, it was a 4-room house, not a 4-bedroom house, but a 4-room house with an outhouse. And sometimes I would explain my life to people and they were like, where are you from? And what century is this? But what we have to realize is that there really are kind of two different Virginias. There's the Virginia that exists kind of in this urban crescent that runs from Northern Virginia down through Richmond and down into the Tidewater area. And then there's the rural part of Virginia that exists on both sides of that. And that runs from the valley down around on the south side and then some of the areas out in the northern neck. And one of the things that I've talked about with my colleagues is that if you think about the job of delegate, first and foremost, my responsibility is to represent the people who elected me here in the 32nd district. But the other part of it is the actual title is state delegate. And so therefore you have a responsibility to think about things and how they impact people across the entire state. And I tell people that you have to be empathetic because the issues and concerns that we have here in Northern Virginia are not necessarily the same issues and concerns they have in the Valley or out in Southwest Virginia or down on South Side. And so I really rely on my upbringing to be able to help me address the issues out there in those areas that maybe aren't getting the attention that they need.
Well, thank you for that, because it is so important, and we continue on this show and through other forums to make sure that we do raise the voices in rural communities and the issues that are so important in those communities across Virginia and across the U.S. So thank you so much for that. And I know that we want to hop into special session coming up here in just, I guess, about a week and a half or so. But I'd love for you to really get into some of the big accomplishments that you had during the regular session. I know that it's been a few months since you've joined us here on Inside Scoop.
Right.
So I want to catch up a little bit on some of the big accomplishments and things you were able to do during the regular session.
So Lindsey, one of the things that has been most amazing to me, because it's like sometimes people will ask me, they say, what has surprised you the most about being a delegate? The thing that has surprised me the most is about the number of things during the last 3 sessions that I can say, this is the first time we've ever done this. And it can go back to Medicaid expansion. It was the first time that that had been done. When we actually had dedicated funding for Metro in the budget for the first time, Metro's been around since 1974. And it was the first time that that was put in there. So there's so many things that are the first time that it's like I've had to start making a written list of it to keep track of it. But again, just with this past session, you can look at passing the Equal Rights Amendment, being the 38th state to be able to do that. And I have 2 adult daughters who it's like when I'm taking that vote, I'm thinking about them. You think about all those gun safety measures that had languished for 20 years, and now they've been passed. And these are all things, when you look at them together, will actually help to save lives, whether it's the 1 handgun a month thing, which prevents Virginia from being a gun running state and guns ending up on the streets of Washington, D.C. or New York City, or the extreme risk protection order, because again, there's about 1,000 gun deaths a year in Virginia, and about 2/3 of them are attributable to suicide. So this has the potential to actually maybe save 600 people's lives and avoid that trauma happening to those families. So that's another set of first. And there's a lot of kind of criticism at times that we're just addressing the gun part of it. And I like to compare this to kind of a computer type of thing. We had those 7 pieces of legislation that addressed what I call the hardware part. But we also put an extra $52 million in mental health money into the budget before we got to COVID-19 to address the software side of the problem as well. So we're looking at the entire problem and trying to address a solution that is going to address everything. We had the Virginia Values Act, first Southern state to be able to pass that. The Omnibus Transportation Bill, $3.7 billion over the next 10 years to make rail reliable and frequent from Northern Virginia. And we were talking earlier, think about this. Northern Virginia, we recognize as being the economic engine for the entire state. But if people start moving in here and it becomes too difficult to get from point A to point B or to get out of the area, they'll stop coming, and our Northern Virginia economy will start to kind of slow down. And so the increase in the transportation funding with the omnibus transportation bill is designed to help us move more people through mass transit. There's the Virginia Clean Economy Act, again, a first, and then the bill that myself and Senator Favola did, the Virginia Energy Plan. All of these things were big, really significant pieces of legislation that we just did in January through March. And so, I mean, it's hard to pick a favorite, but those are the ones that I think are top on my list for right now.
That's fantastic. It's just incredible to see how much was able to get done this last session, and so many meaningful things. Like you said, the ERA, I remember telling my two daughters, who are ages 8 and 10 about it. And one, they're surprised that this was something we had to vote on in 2020, right? Mm-hmm. But two, just such a proud moment, right? To share with your daughters. And it's incredible that you were able to do so much in just a short amount of time. And I know you're about to gear up again for a special session. Tell us a little bit about when that is, what it looks like, and how long you expect it to last.
So those are some really good questions. And I got to tell you, this is going to be a special session like no other special session. So just to kind of put it in perspective, normally when a special session is done, it is done to come back and just address some budget issues. There might be one bill, and that might be it. So it's very limited in scope, because this special session is going to start on the 18th of August, and we don't actually have a defined time frame for when it's going to end. We're kind of projecting that it could be in early September. So the other thing that's different is that because we don't have kind of a defined schedule, that means that we don't have a defined point for when crossover occurs. If you and your audience are familiar with the fact during the regular General Assembly session, like during the 60-day session, we're down there for 30 days and we look at House legislation, then that crosses over, and then we look at Senate legislation, and then we do the conference committees and everything like that. In this particular setup, it's probably going to be much more free-flowing. So if a piece of legislation gets passed by the House, then that piece of legislation will then go over to the Senate, and it won't have to wait for a crossover. Now, the other thing is so we hope to be done in early September. The other thing is that the way that the Constitution is written is that when you come out of the special session, when you adjourn, bills don't become law until after the governor signs them, and it is the first day of the 4th month after the end of the special session. So that means that many of the legislation that just does not have an emergency clause won't take effect until the first part of January. So we could be back in our regular session when the laws that we passed during the special session start to take effect. So that's kind of the logistics of what we're looking at right now.
Wow. So tell us a little bit about some of the priorities that you're focusing on during this special session. I know we talked a little bit about the budget amendment that you're working on, but tell us a little bit more about what your priorities are going into August 18th.
So what I'd like to start with is I'd like to start with kind of some of my personal priorities, and then I think later we can probably talk about some other things, but just to kind of, again, frame this. There's going to be a procedural resolution that is probably going to define a very limited scope for the special session, which is that it will cover the budget, COVID-19, criminal justice reform, and police reform. So depending on how you're counting, that could either be two things, because COVID-19 and the budget could be one, and criminal justice and police reform could be one as well. But I'm counting them as 4 just because it kind of makes it easier for me to think about it. Now, personally, what it is that I've started looking at is I have looked at some budget language amendments to address some of the things that have come out of the COVID-19 crisis. So I'll give you an example. One is about better reporting from the Virginia Department of Health and transparency about how they go about reporting the number of deaths that are attributable to a particular disease. We run into this issue where we have detractors who are saying, this is no worse than the flu. And if they go and they look at the VDH website, well, then it looks no worse than the flu because the way that they've done reporting in the past. We can't have that. We need to be clear and concise with our citizens so that they know that there were this many deaths for the flu and there are this many deaths for COVID-19, and that we can actually compare apples and apples. And so that's one of the things that I'm looking at. Another one is a language amendment, again, for the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. while we've done really well as a state to be able to address this, I think everyone would really kind of agree that we kind of got off to a slow start. And drawing upon my experience in the military, what I'm going to be asking the Virginia Department of Emergency Management to do is to identify for the General Assembly what type of emergency preparedness plans they have in place for other things. So we know that they normally prepare for hurricanes. They probably prepare for tornadoes. But do they prepare for terrorist attacks? Because we've had those before. Do they prepare for pandemics? Well, maybe not, but maybe now. Do they prepare for other types of things? I mean, you have to think about the really negative things that could happen, and then VDEM has to go, how are we going to be able to address these things? From a military perspective, what you end up doing is you do something that's called tabletop exercises. So you get the members of the cabinet together and you say, okay, if this happens, what will you do? And what will you do? And how will we communicate with each other? And if you can't answer those questions, then you have to start fixing it before you actually have to deal with the crisis. Another one is the Virginia Employment Commission. And this is something where we have, I want to say that we've had over 1 million unemployment insurance claims. And those are starting to bog down and take weeks to be able to process. And what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to give VEC the discretionary authority to say, okay, I'm not going to chase down the $25 that I accidentally overpaid you. Instead, I want to process the other 5, 10, 20 new claims that have come in. And right now, they don't have the discretional authority to be able to shift their staff from one thing to another. And sometimes it's simple things like that we just need to be able to address. So those are 3 things that are an outgrowth of what we have seen with COVID-19 that I'm specifically trying to address in the budget, because when the budget gets approved and signed, it takes effect immediately. And these are things that I think need to be addressed almost immediately so that we can continue to work our way through this.
Absolutely. I mean, these are issues too that are so important right now to all of our communities.
Right.
Being able to track the amount of cases we have in Virginia in particular is critical to how we reopen and whether or not we grapple with questions like closing down in the future, right? And so being able to accurately count those seems like a really important measure to take.
Yeah, no, you're entirely correct, because again, I've tried to look at what we've done, where we've been successful, and where we can do things better the next time. Because again, I think we've done really well. I look at the data on a daily basis, and I see where we are and how we are still doing well compared to our peer states or to other states. And we're doing well. But again, we have to be able to address these issues so that we can move forward to kind of what is the post-COVID-19 environment and economy going to look like? And that's the reason why one of the things that I've done as far as asking for money to be put back into the budget, one we've talked about is broadband. The other one is putting money back in for preparation of business-ready sites. So that fits real well with the desire to be able to have people outside doing construction and those type of things, because we have large areas of the state, and primarily around the south side of the state, where we have land that we could bring manufacturing jobs to. But Virginia has been a little bit behind in actually having sites that are ready, so that if Toyota comes in and says, we'd like to set up a parts facility and we need to have it up and running in 18 months, that we don't have the infrastructure in place to do that. So we need to invest in that now, because that would allow folks who are doing construction, doing infrastructure, and those type of things to get back to work. And it would lay the foundation, because we've done so well, that when companies are starting to look around and go, okay, where is a state that's done well managing COVID-19 that I could place my factory? And they might choose Virginia because we have business-ready sites. We've done a good job on COVID-19, and we could actually help lead the Virginia economy out of this current COVID-19 kind of recession that we're in.
Absolutely. And you always do such a great job in focusing on small businesses and making sure that people have the resources they need. What are you hearing right now? I mean, COVID-19 has completely turned our entire worlds upside down for many reasons, on the health side, the education side, the economic side. Let's focus a little bit on the economic side, because I think that's really important. What are you hearing from your constituents about some of the struggles that people are having due to the pandemic?
So it's really interesting, and that's a really good question, Lindsey, because it's affecting different industries in different ways. So the hospitality industry in general, which is a really big deal in Loudoun County as far as vineyards and weddings and hotels and all of those other type of things. At one point in time, I think they were talking about their revenue was off maybe 90 or 95%. I mean, it's just really significant. And that's not just happening here, that's happening across the state. You have other things where it's like we have companies here because they do work for the federal government where they've not been affected at all. But other companies who are working for the federal government, they've been affected because what's happened is that the guidance coming out of the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, as well as the Budget Office, has been inconsistent at the federal level. So some agencies have interpreted and said, we can keep working, we can keep paying our contractors, and those are doing well. Others have called me and said, if I can't get one of the PPP loans that is coming out of the federal government, my business, which I've had for 16 years, I might have to close it down. And that's 45 people that are going to be out of work, 45 people that are then going to be on the unemployment rolls. And so it's like, it really does need to be a coordinated effort between what we're doing at the state level, what's being done at the local level, and then also what's being done at the federal level. But just unfortunately, the federal level has really been getting locked up and bogged down. And it's one of those things where it's not our congressperson specifically, it's the institution itself has just become kind of gridlocked. And so that's what I'm hearing. The other thing is that we are probably processing and addressing about 25 unemployment insurance claims per week. These are people that are having problems. And again, this is in Eastern Loudoun County, where the problems that are happening are not as bad as they are in other parts of the state. I mean, there are other parts of the state that are really being hit a lot harder. And so that's the reason why for some of these budget amendments that I'm talking about, whether it's the business ready sites or being able to allow additional discretionary options for VEC, is so that we can get that unemployment insurance money into people's hands in a more timely manner, as well as be able to start the process of kind of re-energizing the economy.
Absolutely. And it also ties into the amendment you discussed earlier about broadband. You know, hearing a lot from others around Virginia, right? Not being able to have access to good broadband internet really keeps people from transitioning from the office in person to working at home, which so many people obviously need to do right now if possible. So everything that you're working on really is tied in to that economic effort and ensuring that Virginians can get back to work and stay employed and have the ease of being able to have good internet service to conduct businesses or create new small businesses during this time.
Exactly. And think about this, Lindsey. I mean, with rural broadband as the infrastructure, there's a lot of jobs that are currently being done in Northern Virginia that can be done from anywhere in Virginia. If you think about it, our networks are attacked from people who are all over the world. So why couldn't we have the people who are defending our network be in Abingdon or down in Blacksburg or down in Farmville or anything like that? If we have the right infrastructure in place, and the Virginia Jobs Improvement Program, which is another thing that I've been actually working on adding money back into, if we have those things in place and we have a good community college system for doing certifications, then we have the ability to have cyber jobs all over the states. And again, they can be working on contracts that are from the federal government that's up here in Northern Virginia. So again, if somebody can attack our network from anywhere in the world, then I would like to think that we should be able to defend our network from any place in Virginia.
That's true. That's true. Well, these are all really great priorities. And I know in our next segment, we'll talk more broadly about the other issues that will be brought up. But tell us, do you feel confident that these can get accomplished in special session? Because everyone that you have mentioned, gosh, there's such a need for all of it right now. And I know there's many needs that will be addressed in this special session. What do you think as far as your confidence in getting these accomplished?
So that's a really tough question. And the reason why I say that is because one of the things that I have said since I got on appropriations this year, and I actually took the time to read through the entire 601 pages of the budget. And one of the things that I like to say is that the budget is about priorities and a vision of what you want Virginia to be. And that's the standard that we need to look at for everything. If it's a priority, we're talking about making an investment in something today. If it is a vision of what you want Virginia to be, then we're putting money towards something like the business ready sites that will pay off in maybe 3 to 5 years or something like that. But that's the way that you have to think about it. Now, the thing is, we had a really good budget when we were done on March the 12th. We've got more priorities now because of COVID-19, because of criminal justice and police reform than we had on March 12th, and we've got less money. And so it's going to be really difficult because we're going to have some real difficult discussions about what those priorities are. And there's a finite amount of money. And so we're going to have some difficult discussions about that.
Well, and I know that you have done such a great job of meeting with your constituents, even during this tough time during COVID, and connecting with folks online. If the viewers that have interest in this and want to express their opinions to you and reach out to you for additional information, how is the best way people can reach you right now as you're really preparing to go into August 18th?
So you bring up a good point, because it's like we had about a half a dozen town halls that were going to be scheduled right after session, and then we went into the stay-at-home order, so we weren't able to do any of those. We supplemented them with several kind of virtual town halls, and then for a while I was doing a Facebook video after the governor's briefing, so that was pushing information out to people. But you can access and get to me, see what I'm doing on a regular basis from Twitter, which is at David Reid VA. Facebook is also a good place, which is Delegate David Reid. Don't go to my personal one. And then website is delegatedavidreid.com. But you can also use the House email address, which is deldreid@house.virginia.gov. There's a lot of different ways to be able to get in touch with me and my staff. And it's one of the things that I really miss is not being able to go out and visit with people.
It's hard. It definitely is hard right now, but you have offered so many great ways for people to stay connected to you and to voice their opinion and continue to be a part of our democratic process. And I know that we're going to take a short break, but when we get back from break, we're going to talk more about the priorities and the issues that will be discussed and taken into consideration during special session, which, as Delegate Reid said, starts August 18th. So please stay with us. We'll be right back.
Let me tell you about the toughest guy on earth. He does the work of 2 jobs, but only gets paid for one. He's tough enough to feed the man that gave him a lifetime of nourishment. He has the crazy strength to lift the man that raised him up without even flinching. That's right. No employee of the month bonus check here. This guy, this warrior, will always be by his father's side, even if his dad will hardly remember. Good luck finding a gym to train for that. If this guy isn't the toughest guy on the planet, then I don't know who is. Caregiving is tougher than tough. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Opiates has taken everything and everyone I've ever loved away from me. Everything.
I blew my ankle out and I got prescribed pain pills by my doctor.
If making my detox public is gonna help somebody, I'm all for it. I just wish I would have had a warning.
Opioid dependence can happen after just 5 days. Know the truth, spread the truth.
When I was your age, I was just like you, fascinated by stars. But now I get to search for life in the universe. And who knows? Maybe life is looking for us too.
So we're like aliens to them?
Yeah. Does anyone want to be a scientist now?
I do.
Awesome. We need more girls in STEM.
Maybe we can find aliens.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Lindsey Davis Stover, and we're continuing our conversation with Delegate David Reid, who represents the 32nd District here in Virginia. David, thank you again for being with us this evening.
It's really great to be here, and that was really a great first segment. I mean, we covered a lot of material, but I really do appreciate you doing this because it's getting some really important information out to people. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And I know we talked a lot about COVID relief that will be brought up during the next special session. And I wanted to also get to two other really important issues. The budget, as you said, could be encompassed in COVID relief. But let's talk more about, criminal justice reform, also police reform. Tell us a little bit about where you think legislation will go come August 18th.
So again, I mean, it's a really important topic for our time, and those both are really very much intertwined. And this is one of those things where it's like the roots of this problem stretches back 400 years in the state of Virginia, and it has been ignored for far too long. And so now we have to start to address it. And I think what you're going to see is that there's a broad spectrum of solutions. And I mean, we've spent some time talking about how we go about addressing demilitarization. So let me just talk about that for a second. Think about the fact of, like, after 9/11, we all kind of know that we kind of gave up some of our freedoms and some of our rights because we had had a terrorist attack on the United States soil, and it was the first time that anyone had attacked us here since December the 7th, 1941. And so that really kind of changed the mindset of a lot of people. And I think that was kind of what precipitated a lot of these things where we have the transfer of effectively military-style weapons to local police forces. So we've got to look at how we kind of start to roll that back so that we can get back to the restoration of some rights and freedoms that we had right prior to before the 9/11 attack. So that's one of the things that we're talking about. The other thing that I think that we're talking about, and it's a very broad topic, is I look at a lot of this as being a human resources problem. You have to look at what you do in the way of pay, recruitment, and training for police officers. We need to be able to pay our law enforcement officers well enough that we can recruit good people to do that work. There's a really good example in the Virginia State Police Force. They have told us that they have 283 vacancies that they cannot fill because they don't have a pay structure that supports attracting new people. So if they can't attract really good quality people and people from minority communities, then what type of people are they attracting? And as you start to look at that, we need to do a better job about standardizing how we go about screening and vetting people's background to be able to have them come in and do this. So that's part of the whole pay and recruiting process. And then you have to address training. As you start to kind of peel back the layers on this, you find that there are certain areas like the Northern Virginia Criminal Justice Academy that has a really good training program and is actually contributed to by a lot of the jurisdictions in Northern Virginia. But the standards that are applied here may not be standards that are applied at the other criminal justice academies across the state. And so we need to look at being able to standardize those things. Now, this is where it gets tied back into the budget again. Because what we can't do at the state level is push down unfunded mandates on the localities. The localities are suffering just as bad from a budget standpoint of view because of COVID-19. So if we decide that we want them to all be accredited or we want them all to be trained at a certain level, then that goes back to those priorities. We're going to have to find the money in the state budget to say we want everybody to be accredited at the bronze level. And maybe some of them have never been accredited before at all. And so that's going to require additional personnel, additional processes, and things that are going to have to be paid for. But again, this is one of those things where it has been a long time problem in the making. If I go back to that issue about the state police officers, that is a problem developing over the last 20 years. And the state police have come to us and said that we have a $27 million hole in our compensation budget. And we were able to put about $11 to $16 million into that before the COVID-19 crisis. So again, there's a lot of these tough choices that are going to have to be made, but these are things that happened on someone else's watch. And now we're trying to address these things and trying to make things better as we look to going forward into the future.
Well, we've had an unprecedented level of activism around these issues. And, even during the midst of a pandemic, people have, made signs, marched in the streets, done whatever they can to really just ensure that their voice is heard and push for the needed change that, as you said, has been so long overdue. And a lot of the push is around more civilian involvement in the process, because that provides transparency and hopefully ultimately accountability. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that transparency and what's happening here in Virginia, but across the country, is something that we desperately need to ensure there is accountability, because, that is what people are demanding when they're marching in the streets.
No, you bring up a really good point, because again, we need to be able to address this issue of that when something bad happens, that there is a process in place so that people can actually know that the problem is being addressed, and that if you have an individual police officer or a sheriff, because usually it's not an entire institution, but if you have a individual who is not behaving properly, that there is a proper review process, and the most common way to do this is through some type of citizens review board. Now, we're going to have to figure out how we determine who sits on that citizen review board, because I think you need to have people that are probably familiar with law enforcement or have some knowledge of how the process works. And so we have to figure out how to do all of that. But I think people want to know that we're not just kind of sweeping these things under the rug and letting it continue on. Some of the incidences that occurred in Minnesota were really one of those type of things that indicated that these individuals actually had recurring problems as far as complaints filed against them, but it just kept getting brushed aside. And that just can't be acceptable. And again, I'm putting kind of my business hat on and saying that this is a human resources problem, where, again, we have to be able to have a process in place that says we're not going to allow this type of behavior, and so therefore you can no longer wear a badge in Virginia, and you need to take your services someplace else, especially if somebody is a repeat offender. And one of the ways to get to that is through some type of citizen review board.
Right. And I think, one of the questions, and we've done many shows on this too, and one of the questions that I keep getting asked over and over again is, do you think we're being heard? Do you think that our elected leaders are hearing us when we are crying out in the streets, when we are risking our health to get out there and march, whether it's in Fairfax County, Loudoun County, all across the Commonwealth? And I think that's a question that really begs an answer. Do you feel like our elected leaders are really hearing the people right now? Because this really has been an unprecedented amount of activism around an issue that is long overdue to be fixed, but also it's horrifying, honestly.
It really is. And you bring up a good point, because I will tell you that people are being heard. And I know that each delegate deals with this in different ways. Some really like to put their opinions and views out on social media. I think, as we were talking earlier, one of those things, it's like I look at every piece of email that comes into my delegate email box. I may not read all of them completely, but it's like I look at every one of them and get the general gist of what people's concerns are. And that helps me register kind of what the view and the feelings are of what people are thinking about. And I know that collectively across the entire Democratic caucus, we have had some really heartfelt discussions about the fact that people are crying out for substantive change and that we need to make change. And we know that these are things that needed to be done for years, if not decades, and have just, again, been brushed aside. And so we're coming to the point where it's like we have to do things, and we're being very thoughtful. I mean, the level of coordination that we are doing within the caucus to be able to craft the very best solutions that we can is really unprecedented, I think, for either the Democratic side or the Republican side. We have these small work groups that are working together with people that are of interested parties on these different topics, and we're trying to hash out all of the internal differences. Because again, it's like we have to recognize that things that in Northern Virginia might be different down in Richmond, it might be someplace else. And again, it's like when we talk about just like police force accreditation, we're accredited here in Northern Virginia, but there are other places that may never have been done it before, and maybe they don't have the money to do it. And so when we say we want everybody to be accredited, then that's a different level of investment. Or if we want to do more thorough background checks on individuals, or if we want to set up citizen review boards, how is that going to be done? And quite honestly, I've said these are things that we have to do statewide. These are things that should not be local option, because if we're looking at addressing a systemic problem, then we need to be willing to make systemic change across the entire state and not leave it up to individual localities.
Absolutely. And I think that systemic change really calls for bold and courageous leadership. So I'm so happy to hear that those working groups are going on, because it's such an important time. And it's so important that the outcry in our state and in our country is met with the right policy during this time. So I'm happy to hear that. You know, one of the things that is so important too, and whether it's this issue or COVID or anything else we've talked about tonight, is the importance of voting. And this is a big, big year to vote. And we, talk about it, or at least I try to talk about it every show, because it's so important that people make a plan to vote. And I know right now, during these times where economically it's tough, health obviously is a huge concern for everybody during the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit, one, about the importance of voting, obviously, but two, can people feel safe going to the polls in November? And what is that going to look like for folks?
So let me first start by talking about the importance of voting, because we had in, I think it was 2017, the example of Shelley Simons running against David Yancey down in the Newport News area. Yeah. And the deciding factor of that was drawn out of a bowl because they were equal in the number of votes. Now, you could maybe question whether or not that last vote for David Yancey should have been counted, because the story is that it was dug around the box and found. But despite that, had one more person come out and voted for Shelley Simon, then you would never have had to draw a name out of a bowl, and it would have then been Shelley Simon instead. So imagine this. In 2017, we were just one seat away from going into a power sharing agreement. And you think about all the things that we did then, that was the first that I talked about, and all the first we did in 2020, imagine what we could have done sooner had that not been the case. So it's so important for people to go out and vote, because your vote really does count. Now, this year, of course, people really need to take advantage of the fact that when we passed the law in the 2020 session that allowed for no excuse absentee balloting, there used to be I think there might have been 13 or 14 different excuses that you had to use. Now you can do no excuse absentee balloting. And I've already gone in and requested mine, because I want mine to be able to come. I want to be able to vote in the safety and security of my home and then mail it back in. Now, that all being said, I will tell you that I have had personal discussions with the folks at the State Board of Election, as well as the local registrar and the local Board of Election, and they are doing everything they can to make sure that it is going to be a safe environment for those individuals who decide to go out and vote in person. But first and foremost, I would encourage people to use the no excuse absentee balloting, and you can find that on my Twitter page or other people's page as well. I mean, it's really very prevalent and out there as far as information is concerned. And some of the things that we're looking at for the special session is, do we need to authorize the local boards of election additional authority to be able to do drop boxes in places that are other than the election board, because many people are now being apprehensive about what's going on with the Federal Postal Service. And so should they get their absentee ballot and then want to take it and just drop it off? So a lot of that is still in play and things that we'll know more about after the special session. Or it's like right now, you have to have somebody witness your absentee ballot. Well, if you happen to live alone and you're concerned about COVID-19, do you really want or need to get somebody to witness it when they can actually receive the ballot and match up your signature against the one that's already on the file? So again, there's things like this that we're looking at. Another one that's being looked at that's going into the budget is what's called a cure notice, so that if they happen to get an absentee ballot from me and they can't read my signature, then they would then be able to call me and say, is this really David Reid? Can you go through the verification process that you would if you were actually standing in front of them? So there's things like that that we're still working on to make this upcoming election more safe and more secure. And I just can't emphasize enough to have people go out and vote, because these things really do make a difference in your lives, whether it's the things that we've been talking about with COVID-19, the criminal justice reform, or the police reform. And I can tell you some of the best ideas that I've gotten from legislation are ideas from constituents who get involved. So, I mean, I really do listen to those things and take those things to heart.
Well, that's so important that you're bringing those up during the special session, because I know there are obviously a lot of concerns, and you're right, whether it's, concern for safety while we're trying to vote during a pandemic, or as you mentioned, the attack on the Postal Service. People are really worried about whether or not their vote will actually be counted during this time. So I'm so glad to hear that during special session, you all will be bringing up some important issues that will help people feel more comfortable and confident about their vote in November.
Yeah, you're so correct. I mean, and then again, we did things during the 2020 session to make it easier to vote as well. Because again, there had been 20 years of historical precedent in the Virginia General Assembly where the other party was increasingly trying to restrict access to voting, because their concern was that they would lose grip on power if more people voted. And that's just a wrong approach. I mean, because you want as many people to vote as possible. I mean, during the election, when I got elected in 2017, we only had about 47% people turn out. So while that doesn't sound like a very good number, that was about 5 percentage points higher than normal, which is about 42%. And those additional 5% of people that came out are what allowed us to be able to pick up 15 seats in the Virginia General Assembly. And it was one of the largest turnovers of seats, I think, in the entire 400-year history. And that's because just that 5% more people decided to go out and vote. Just think what could happen if 10% people more decided to go out and vote. They're the ones who can actually decide these elections.
Right. And I love that you brought up the example in 2017 with Shelley Simons, because I feel like we can't talk about that enough, and it really takes every excuse out of my vote doesn't count, or it doesn't matter, I'm just one vote, because that was a situation where literally one vote would have mattered a lot, right? And I think we can't, I love that you brought that up, because I think we can't talk about that example enough. And it was an example I hope that, yes, we're all very familiar here with in Virginia, but I hope it is an example that went nationwide, right? Because I think it's so important that no matter where you live, right, no matter what zip code you live in, your vote matters. And all of the issues that we have talked about, are so important to our daily lives. And if you're not able to vote, your voice ultimately isn't heard. And, I know in Virginia, we have elections every single year, right? And there's probably a little election fatigue, if you will, here in Virginia. But this year, as we've heard every year, it's the most important election of our lifetime. But I've said this before, there's just a different gravity to this year that I think we're all feeling, right? From the national level on down. And so I love that you brought that example up, because that example of Shelley Simons could be in any district across Virginia, across the U.S., and could really make a difference in people's lives, how the election goes. So thank you for bringing that up. Thank you for taking up the different measures to keep voting safe for our community and Virginians, because it's so important this year. I feel like now more than ever.
No, it really is. And one of the nice side benefits about the Shelley Simon story is that she's an outstanding legislator as well. And so it's been a real pleasure to have her part of the caucus and part of the General Assembly. I mean, she is so thorough, and her experience having served on the school board is one of those things that is a very valuable perspective right now when we're dealing with COVID-19 related things and how it is impacting local school systems. And so she's just been really valuable to have as part of the team.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, I know we've talked a lot about what will be up in special session, and it's hard to believe that so many big issues are going to be taken up in relatively a short amount of time. And so there are going to be some major budget discussions, I'm sure, that are going to be had, and probably some really tough decisions, right, of what can be done now and what may have to wait. And so can you talk a little bit, walk us through how the caucus or how you yourself, make those hard decisions? Because I think that is a really informative way to express, policy and ensure that our viewers understand the process.
So that's a really good question, because it's like, I don't know if I'd mentioned it before or not, but it's like I'm now a member of the Appropriations Committee. I'm also a member of Transportation and Privileges and Elections. So when we're talking about these voting rights issues and making voting safe, that is something that is very near and dear to me because of the committee I serve on. And then, of course, the budget stuff is because I'm on appropriations as well. And I will tell you that we have an outstanding House Appropriations Committee staff. So they go through and they look at all of these things, and we spend time working with them. And there's several different subcommittees that will look at different budget things as far as budget amendments and budget items. Now, what will happen is on the 18th, we're going to get the money kit committees, which include Senate Finance and House Appropriations, at 9:30, and it'll be available for streaming to anybody. We'll get an update from the governor and his team on what the reforecast is going to look like. So at that particular point in time, that snapshot, we will have a much better idea of what type of deficits we're dealing with, how we have actually recovered and to what degree, and how much we're going to have available or how much we're going to have to cut from other things. So all of that will come into play then. So there's an outstanding staff at the governor level. So Secretary Lane just does a fantastic job of being able to explain that. And then Ann Oman, who is the director for the House Appropriations Committee staff, just does a fantastic job of coordinating them. And the way that it works is you look at all of these things, and then as a member of the Appropriations Committee, I will then take time to look at the different amendments and the things that we're talking about, and we'll go and sit down with the individual analysts. So there's an analyst who deals with higher education. There's one that deals with K through 12. There's one that deals with medical type of things. So they all deal with these different areas. Some of them have multiple portfolios, but I will spend time going and talking to each one of them to try to understand both the primary and secondary impacts of what we're either adding or taking away, as well as what might be the potential unintended consequences, because it's those unintended consequences, the things that we can't see or that we haven't thought about or that we can't plan for, that will kind of come back to like eat us alive later. And so I try to spend a lot of time talking with them to understand what our decisions are going to make so that I can make the most informed decision as possible. And I know that other members of the Appropriations Committee do the same thing. So just like any other committee, there are subcommittees and then there's the committee, and we'll review all of these things with the staff. And then those proposals will then go to the general House for being able to be looked at and voted on. And when it gets to the House, all of those amendments can be voted on as a block and say, yes, we agree with everything. The House Appropriation Committee is brilliant. Or someone can say, oh no, hold on a second. I don't like amendment number 5, and I want to pull that out because I'd like to make a statement about it, or I'd like to have it killed. And so that could happen as well. So it's very much like any other piece of legislation, just extremely complicated. And the overall budget is I want to say it's $135 billion budget. And think about this. It's a $135 billion budget, which is the 8th largest budget of any state in the nation. We are making decisions that affects, I believe it is a $544 billion economy. And our economy is comparable in size to Sweden or Argentina. And we do all of this as part-time citizen legislators. And so it's like any other bill, just that it has a much broader impact and it has a lot more moving pieces.
Well, one of the things I've always admired about you is how thorough you are and how much you listen to the constituents that put you in office. So thank you for all of that hard work, because I know you're going to have to make some really tough decisions in a few weeks. And I know it gives me peace of mind. I'm sure everyone watching that you take such a thoughtful and thorough approach to those decisions. So thank you for that.
Well, I appreciate that. And I have to tell you, this is by far the best job I've ever had. I mean, you have the opportunity to listen to your constituents, hear what their concerns are, and then you have the ability to go to Richmond and maybe do a few things that are going to positively impact their lives. And I always use that as my standard. It's like, am I doing something to actually make people's lives better? Because you can go to Richmond and you can do things that would make things worse. And so, kind of like a doctor, I try first to do no harm. And then going back to that thing, it's like, what are the priorities for what we need to focus on today? And what do we need to invest in for the future? Because we do have a responsibility for future generations as well. And so I really do enjoy this. And it's something that is really kind of a good fit for my personality and my background. So I really do appreciate that. And I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to do this today.
Well, you've had an incredible career of service, from the military to now serving us all here in Virginia. So thank you for that. And I know we just have a minute or so left, but during COVID, I feel like we've all rediscovered new things, new books, new movies. Tell us one thing that you've rediscovered or discovered for the first time during COVID.
So it's interesting, because one of the things that I did early on is I tried to do a lot of the around the house projects that needed to be addressed. So I was really very industrious during the first 4 or 5 or 6 weeks, got a lot of things done. And then I kind of ran out of steam with some of those things. I also did get to read some books, some fun books that I had not been reading, because I spend a lot of time reading things that are related to work or things that are related to being a delegate. And so I had a chance to just read some books for casual purposes. And I started trying to go back out on occasion and ride my bicycle a little bit. And we've spent time just playing games together as a family. So it's things like that that I've done that have been different than what we might have done had we not been in a stay-at-home order.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Delegate Reid, for joining us this evening. Thank you all for watching. We hope you have a good evening, and we look forward to seeing you next week here on Inside Scoop.